Yes, thank you. So welcome to our webinar. Yeah, I would consider this not necessarily to be sort of a presentation where I pretend to have all of the expertise. I liked how Hillary introduced this as a sort of a community of practice. I see this also a little bit as a sort of a self-help seminar, because it started from this observation that I had where, because well, perhaps to explain a little bit my role in background, I am also at the University of Maastricht, where I am on the one hand doing research on the EU, but I'm also the responsible for teaching professionalization, where I need to help the starting colleagues, but also those that are more advanced to organize these type of events. And the observation that I would like to start from is this observation that typically those that are most committed to teaching are also the ones that actually sometimes struggle the most or have most difficulties in work-life balance. And this is an observation that I had that was not necessarily only confined to sort of my own teaching experience and that of mastery, but actually that I increasingly see and find throughout the educational system. Perhaps as a small anecdote, when I was also we don't have because you have these type of teachers that have a very long family tradition in education. I don't have such a tradition, but I think my current score, my sister, for example, is a kindergarten teacher. My wife is also teaching, but then in primary education. So I had many exchanges with them, and they all sort of shared a similar notion. I think I'll cover one anecdote from my sister when she was becoming a teacher. She worked in kindergarten, and so for one of the classes, she wanted to or had to develop a gift because it was Father's Day, and typically what you do in primary school is then you fabricate something, right, that you give to your father. And she wanted to give an original gift, which basically was a drawing of the kid, but then she would sort of print it on fabric and put it on a tote bag. The event basically, like the kids drew for 2 hours, but my sister and ultimately also my mother spent the entire weekend and 2 evenings sewing all of those tote bags. She spent a lot of time. I mean, she did it once and never again. But we all have these type of things where we end up spending way more time on parts that don't necessarily instill learning. And I've also noticed this in higher education, that we typically have a lot of activities, or that we start spending disproportionate amounts. I also put the example of the VR goggles on. It was something that I had to think of when I was on a committee having to do. So it was a research grant for teaching innovation, where I basically was plowing through. I think we had like 15 to 20 applications that all focused on VR applications. But then often it feels more as if the innovation was sort of to do something with VR, but it was not always clear what students would gain from it. And this is sort of something that I've been intrigued by, is that basically is all of the teaching that we do, does that always result in learning? And the time is particularly pressing in a sense, because in the Dutch higher education system, there's now lots of talks about budget cuts. And thus the question of, can we teach or offer the same educational quality with less time? So that sort of got me to think a bit more structurally about this issue. But before I properly start, I would like to add a disclaimer that this is not intended to be a plea to devote less time to education, because typically when I talk about teaching efficiency, I have some colleagues that are so much into research that would say like, that's perhaps interesting because then I have less. I can basically spend less time on my education. This is for me not necessarily the claim. It's more sort of to find a healthy balance. It's also not an argument to stifle innovation and experimentation, because I think that's also an important aspect of it. What I do hope to attain, or what is my little bit of also my objective, is to promote I would say a critical reflection amongst you or amongst the teaching community on how do we teach or what do we teach, and add an efficiency reflex to it. I hope also to instill a recognition of the agency that we have in designing our work, because I think much of the hurdles that we face, or the sometimes also the causes of our inefficiencies, they are not necessarily due to our own design. And lastly, I would like to sort of launch a call for critical benchmarking in scholarship on teaching and learning, because this is also part of my frustration in trying to study this subject, is that I haven't really found that many benchmarks or that many ideas to build on. So what I would like to do in my short presentation is basically do three things. First of all, assess like what is the problem. Second, explore a bit of the causes. So why do we have inefficiencies in our education and our teaching? And lastly, touch upon some of the potential ways to fix it. I can't see the chat or your video simultaneously, but I don't mind being interrupted, so don't hesitate to put on your microphone if you have a question during the presentation already, or if some things are unclear. But anyway, I'll proceed. There should be sufficient time afterwards also during the Q&A. So what is the problem? I would like, perhaps as a first exercise, or a small exercise, is to have you think about your last week. And my question to you, what are the 5 biggest teaching tasks that you've accomplished this last week? And if you'd like, you could also share them in the chat. I'll give you a minute or two to think about it. So what are the 5 biggest teaching tasks that you accomplished last week? I will not unleash any AI or determine your job prospects based on that, but it's sort of to get the ball a bit rolling, or get ourselves or thinking to start.
Want us to chime in, or do you want us to put things in the chat?
I think perhaps it's the easiest to put something in chat, because then it's easier. It's sort of to. I think you can also just leave it for yourself if you prefer not to share. But it's a thought exercise, right? So I'll just list the ones that I did, but it might also be nice to see what others have been doing and apply the next steps, or sort of to the same exercise, or to the same teaching tasks. So this is, I think, what it looked like for me. I do have to say that I'm sort of in between 2 teaching blocks. So I've responded to student emails, did some grading. Perhaps the third one needs an explanation. We in Maastricht have a course on interviewing skills, where students are also asked to conduct an interview, and then typically they assign staff members to be the interviewee. So I also did that for 2 groups. That's 2 hours. I am planning for next period a teaching trip to Brussels, a field trip. So I also had to create and craft guides for that, and revised reading lists. Now, I don't know whether you had the time to already put some things in the chat. Yeah. But for me, the next question then is like, so we typically have these sort of mixed bags. But which of these do you think then contribute most to student learning? And thinking about like what is these contributions on the one hand, and then on the other hand, basically how much time did it require me to do such a thing? And typically what I end up with is that, so for student emails, you can also wonder to what extent students I think half of them were these typical responses of, well, read the syllabus. But then I took the time and effort to really also point out the pages and so forth. So that took quite a lot of, well, not a lot of time, but at least sort of like an hour and a half. And ultimately may not have necessarily contributed to much learning. I think same with feedback forms. It really depends on whether they're opened or not, and how the students would act upon it. The rough guide, I mean, like it took some work. It will not contribute to learning, but at the same time, you could say, well, at least the experience of the field trip might be very useful. what I wanted to do, but it is sort of is more to get the ball rolling or to think along the lines of what are all the different things we do as part of our teaching load, and are students really learning from it, or what are they learning from these sort of interventions? This is what for me is the key question, right? On the one hand, we can think about the effectiveness. To what extent does our teaching instruction or teaching intervention, if you will, contribute to student learning? And then it's more basically like, what have they learned from it? But also to think about efficiency. So how much time, finances, energy, because sometimes also think certain emails that are very sensitive. So last week, I actually didn't put that. One of the emails was also about a parent, actually. A parent emailing about an assessment that he was unhappy with, where you then basically are also drained in terms of energy, because you're basically having to follow up all of your previous steps, making sure that you did all of the grading well, double checking with others, also checking the legal status, whether we're doing fine. And ultimately, it was just sort of like one response to one email. And it took a lot of energy, because in the end, also I spent the evening a bit stressed about whether I did not miss out on anything, or so how much resources from the teacher, but also the learner were needed to attain this outcome. Because also sometimes we have a lot of teaching interventions or teaching activities that do require a lot of time from the students, that don't always result in a lot of being learned. So I have to think about like an example that we have. So the length of a paper or a thesis, for example, is for me a typical thing, where we have, for the research master, we have a thesis of over 30,000 words. And the question that I would have then basically is like, would students learn as much from a I'll rephrase it. Would students learn 3 times as much from a 30,000 page thesis than from a 10,000 word thesis? And if the answer is not, then it may not necessarily be the most efficient time spent on behalf of the learner, but perhaps also not from the side of the teacher, who then also has to read those 30,000 words and has to offer feedback onto it. So it's not just only, I would say, time as a resource, it's also sometimes finances and emotional energy. Not only from the teacher's side, but I would also think about the learner side, like how much time would they invest, and then what do they learn from such an activity? Right. I think this, like putting a focus on effectiveness and efficiency, also has, I think, an implicit comparativist angle to it. That is, once you start thinking about like what are effective or perhaps ineffective means, you're already thinking also in terms of what are alternatives that might be more effective or more efficient to attain the same outcome. And I'll come back to that later, but I think that that's also where one of the challenges lies when you think about effectiveness and efficiency. It's basically that you think also about like what are the alternatives available, and that you can benchmark them in some way, shape, or form. So I am interested in efficiency and effectiveness, but I also realized, or I quickly discovered, that there's actually not that much on efficiency in teaching. If you look at the scholarship on teaching and learning, or if you look at teaching professionalization materials, most of the time it's sort of like, I wouldn't say an afterthought, but it comes in as sort of, at the end, you may also want to take that into consideration when you, for example, design an assessment. But it is rarely sort of a dominant focus. And most of the time what you see, I would say, in the literature, specifically if it's about teaching innovation, is at least showing some effectiveness. And I put the emphasis on like some effectiveness, because what we often lack is a clear benchmarking. So we're seeing, this is a new teaching method, but then it is often compared to what was the status quo before, not necessarily the best alternative out there. What I also notice is that although we were, like, or at least my struggle in engaging with a lot of scholarship on teaching and learning literature, is that there's often limited attention to transferability. So to what extent can these innovations also apply in my teaching environment? So of course you have to adapt it to some extent, but that's, I would say, already available to a limited extent, which makes sometimes this sort of benchmarking difficult to think about alternatives. But for me, the biggest hurdle is that there's even less reflection on the investment needed from teachers and students. So very rarely would I encounter basically, this is what it all required me to do. How much more time did I need to get this new teaching method or this alternative assessment method implemented? And I think that this is often also where some of the challenges lie. I do recognize there's a bit more attention to this, specifically if you think about active learning or I'm thinking about simulations, for example. There is a lot more reflection on reuse and thinking also about scalability. But I also generally found there is a sort of a less or a lack of systematic attention to this topic. I did found, by the way, some reflection on this issue in primary and secondary education literature. So I put on the Lazy Teacher's Handbook up there by James Smith. I've read part of it. I think it's a very useful resource, but it starts from much the same sort of observation as I started my presentation. Basically, what if we taught less, but they learned more? Also recognizing that there's a lot of teachers that are very overworked and stressed. But then because the key argument or the gist of the handbook is basically that you should shift the onus from the teacher, like trying to fill out as much things that you could do as a teacher, to the learner. And in that sense, I do borrow a little bit from their insights, but I would like to, I would say, kick this up a notch. Right, so now to the second point that I had, like, how did we get to this point, or why is efficiency not so prevalent as a perspective? And I would like to just ask this question. If you think about your own teaching and some of the teaching tasks that you think are not so efficient, why do you think that is the case? Why do you think, if you look at some of the teaching that you're doing, have not really been, or which tasks are you doing, let's put it that way, that you consider to be less effective or less efficient? Why are you doing those? If you can either unmute or you can point it out in the chat. I'm just curious as to if there are exercises that you feel or time that you spent. I'll take a sip in the meantime. Or is nobody willing to share their otherwise I'll just keep presenting and then okay.
Johan, I wouldn't mind sharing something if I can.
No, please go ahead.
So something that I did a lot over the past few years, but I always find not super efficient, is students often have to write these minor writing assignments throughout the year, throughout the semester, and we provide like individual feedback on these minor assignments. But because there are so many students, the feedback we give, okay, it's individual, but it's so superficial that they don't actually learn a lot from that, while we put so much time and effort into it, and we do it constantly. And that's one of the things that I think, why do we keep doing this? Because, I mean, students like the idea of having individual feedback, and we like to claim that we give individual feedback, I suppose. I don't know. But to me, it feels so inefficient, and the learning that they get from it is so limited. But again, that's just my experience.
Yeah. But why my question is like, so on the one hand is because students like to have that, right? That you mentioned, sort of like if you look into the why, it's because of students' demands.
Well, yeah, students demand it, and universities also like to push it, like to offer it. Oh, if you come study with us, you get individual, teaching, almost personal teaching, and I think that's part of it. And students want it also, and we also like to think that it really helps them, that it's the best way of doing things with individual feedback. I'm just not so sure that it really is.
Yeah, I think that you touch upon two elements that I would like to pick up further. I think some of it is sort of like self inflicted, if I may call it such. On the other hand, there's also sort of an expectation either from above or like for policy or from students that we do a certain set of tasks, right? I think this question of these sort of demands from above, I think typically about the accreditation cycle or quality assurance questions. Sometimes we do have to teach a certain amount of, or provide for a number of contact hours or number of feedback opportunities, a minimum number. Sometimes it's the interpretation, I would say, and this is for me, most often it's the interpretation of above, either it's our program coordinate, like management, or our faculty leadership that requires that or transforms this sort of accreditation expectations into concrete policies that we have to abide by. Some of these are not necessarily, I would say, set up in the most efficient of manners. I think also sometimes we are compelled to engage in these in ways of showing excellency or doing something special. I think Gilles pointed out, well, we want to be seen or we want to marketize ourselves as, but I think sometimes it's also like for our individual choices. I think now we have a growing appreciation of teaching career paths or that you're not only recognized for your research excellence, but also your teaching excellence. But how do you show teaching excellence? You can't show teaching excellence by just giving very good lectures, right? Typically, you're expected them to do all sorts of great innovative things, innovating for the sake of innovating, or doing something differently for the sake of doing something differently, which is not always the most effective manner. Sometimes it might also just be to facilitate the administration, because the leadership wants us to have basically all the same type of assessment formats or have the same deadlines or work through a specific system of course organization, accommodating rooms, or to give another example. So we're kind of sometimes constrained by these sort of policies. Also ourselves, I think this is for me the critical one that I find, or the most difficult one to overcome, in the sense that it's, well, on the one hand it's the easiest, but also the more difficult, because it's about it's innate in ourselves that we care for our students, so we want to give them good as much support as possible, and therefore sometimes we overcommit, or we spend far more time for any little gain in learning. We may have a love for experimentation, and I would say that's definitely not a bad thing. So we do want to experiment with different teaching methods, explore, have some room also to fail, and thereby also invest a lot more time in teaching. And for students, sometimes we also, well, I think we do a lot of our teaching activities because we want them to learn, but at the same time, sometimes we also like them to have a nice experience, or a life experience, or have fun in class. But that might not always be the most learning or learningful experience. Now, my claim is not that none of these sort of factors are bad in itself. I think my major point that I want to make is basically choosing is losing. If we, for example, organize our teaching in a certain way, we do have to accept that it may reduce the freedom to organize our teaching in a more efficient manner. So my key point is basically that I think if we reflect on the effectiveness and efficiency implications of these choices, at least it's a conscious and deliberate choice. So we know why we did it, and potentially also why it may come at a cost. So I think things like accountability or fairness across students may be important elements, also, for example, for accreditation, but may limit the freedom that we have to organize our teaching in a more efficient or effective manner. So these sort of factors can also push us to organize our teaching in a less efficient manner. More broadly, I think that this is sort of the constraint in which we work, that the work environment also pushes increasingly to, I would say, the stronger influence of these accreditation or these other factors, I would say, that go beyond students learning as a key goal or key objective in our educational design. And that has to do with the work environment that pushes increasingly these other factors to be taken into consideration. I think primarily this marketization of higher education is a driving force that is not only a growing concerns about students as customers and making sure that the student feels as if their demands or needs or are satisfied. It's also this growing pressure for accountability that, because it is that higher education works on government support, we have to show basically to the public that all the money is being spent accountably. So you get all of this pressure for accreditation cycle. You also get a whole class, I would say, within the university administration and a sort of role division where you'd have administrators that gain increasing power, even if it's, for example, also fellow academic staff that are put into roles of boards of examiners or that have to sort of set policies. But because I think that you have this compartmentalization of different teaching roles and administration roles, you also get increasingly sort of I would say constraint on how we can design our education. What I also think does not necessarily help is that there's a lack of knowledge on alternatives, so that we quickly end up in this TINA situation. There is no alternative. We have to do it because the accreditation says so, but we have very limited view on how other universities, for example, in our own country, would deal with certain demands from accreditation or have dealt with similar issues. I think, for example, Gen AI policy is currently also a very good one, where you can have policies that constrain us or create a lot of work for us in terms of fraud or detecting fraud, but there can also be very lenient, far more efficient manners of dealing with detecting or remedying the use or inappropriate use of generative AI. So I think that this sort of lack of knowledge on alternatives is, I think, also limiting the extent that we quickly just accept whatever is being said as well. You need to organize your teaching in such a manner, and then we'll just run by it. You need to meet with the students at least X times a block, or you need to engage or offer feedback at least at 5 different opportunities. I think there's also collective action problems in education. For me, what really strikes me is that the slowness sometimes by which things change. So there are problems that I know that all colleagues basically feel the same about, or many colleagues feel the same about. So I think I mentioned this example of word limits for theses. This is something that has been discussed already, I think, for 5-6 years, but nobody has really picked it up. I think part of the challenge is a typical collective action problem where the upfront investment of, let's say, a course coordinator or a program director may be quite high, so that they don't bother putting in all of the effort to redesign a course or to engage, or at least to lobby or to convince those few holdout colleagues, and thus the problem lingers on. And then the last point that I wanted to say, well, what can constrain this, or why do we end up in such a situation, is I think workloads, pressure also squeezes mental capacity for critical reflection. I think the less time we have, basically, we get this tunnel vision in a way that we can't really remedy some of the ills because we don't stop, look back, reflect. Why are we doing things in a way? So, like one example, I think, is also does every assignment need to have feedback? I think I'm experimenting now with assignments that don't have feedback. So you give some exercises, not too long, but not always. Like, do you need to give individualized feedback? You can also just say, well, you need to submit it, and then you just quickly peruse through it and give potentially, or perhaps not, class feedback on a specific assignment. But that only sort of started to, I realized only that it was an option when I had the time to reflect and have a discussion with other people. But I think if you have the sort of tunnel vision, it's difficult sort of to see alternative means. Right. Sorry, I'm just checking why I'm doing on time. Okay, I have 3 more slides and then I can open it up. So how can we fix it? I think there is a shift, I think sometimes needed, an attitude at multiple levels. I would say at the managerial level, I had a former vice dean of education. I think that for me said it in a very good way, that she saw her role as a vice dean as shielding staff from every of the impulses coming from above. So I think this idea of educational manager or as a shield or as a deflector or as a filter, at least, to make sure that staff or teachers have sufficient discretion in organizing teaching in an efficient way is actually a very productive way of going about. I think the opposite, basically, where there's managers taking very strict interpretation of how specific demands from, be it government, the market, or students have to be interpreted. I think that's typically sort of the recipe for inefficiencies. The teacher, and I'll come back to that also a bit more later. I think I'm quite a large fan of Brookfield's book on becoming a critically reflective teacher, but I think that's also for me where many of these things started, is to sort of create space to reflect critically on our teaching, what we're doing, why we're doing it, what actually does it bring to student learning, as well as setting of boundaries or recognizing our agency that we have in implementing certain policies. To give an example, perhaps again on sort of feedback, but we have very lengthy forms for summative feedback. And even though you could say, well, I think this is sort of I used to be very diligent trying to fill in these forms to great length, because I thought this would help students the most. But as a summative assessment, I could also sort of suggest that this is, or at least limit the in-text feedback and put more emphasis on oral follow-up with students if they are interested, so that way I can make sure that anyway. So it's about setting boundaries also in terms of not necessarily implementing everything in the most strictest of ways as possible, and then also then looking for your own agency in that. And then lastly, on the student side, I think it may also put greater focus on the students, because if we focus on efficiency, then basically it's about what does a student learn. And so we might have to also flip the script a bit and think more about what are the various activities that students perform. And so I haven't discussed, for example, all of the work that takes place outside of the classroom, but there is this very strong emphasis on all of the things that happen in a synchronous learning environment. We focus a lot on the lectures, the tutorials that we provide, the personal meetings that we have, sometimes the feedback that we give, but we focus very little on basically, if we've assigned the reading, what will students then do with that reading? But that's quite crucial, because that determines how much they may or may not learn from it. What are the learning strategies that they have? We used to have actually a program where students helped each other acquire better learning strategies, and you have the typical student that marks everything in their course manual. But should we so therefore also perhaps invest more energy and more effort at monitoring or supervising or supporting or coaching students in what they do outside of the classroom? And I think what we had during the COVID pandemic with this focus on asynchronous learning was great, but I have the impression that this has completely subsided again since we've moved back to in-class teaching. It also puts some responsibility to the student, or shifts a bit of the responsibility to the students, so that they take ownership of their own learning. But I wanted to give a few final remarks on the teacher side, because I do think that this is a little bit more challenging than it seems. I think, yeah, there are certain things that are like quick wins are always available, but I also find this quite challenging because it requires a number of things that I would say are perhaps not so easily to attain. First of all, it requires, I think, a radical focus on the learner, or rather learners. And because, well, and I would say learners, because not everybody learns in the same way, and not everybody responds equally to the same types of instructions or learning materials. So how can we make sure that, can we think actually of a design of teaching that is efficient for every learner, or that is equally efficient for every learner, or equally effective? So I think that can be quite challenging. I also think it does require extensive benchmarking or comparison of different learning activities. So we need to know more about what options are there. What are the different teaching methods that we can use to trigger learning? Because there's multiple ways to teach a specific subject. So we need to think about sort of benchmarking, when to use which means to the largest effect. And then finally, I think what it does require, and this builds on this becoming a critically reflective teacher, is that we need to be able to reflect critically not only on our own proficiency with various teaching methods, because we could easily say, well, so my feedback, if I give a thesis supervision session, I can give the same feedback 3 times to the student and the student doesn't pick it up. But is that really because of the inefficiency of the methods, or is it rather because of the way that I structure my feedback? Or is it the way that I organize the modalities so that individual feedback would work, but it's just how do I provide the feedback? So so that makes it also very difficult to say, well, whether it is something that you need to change in your teaching approach. Is it something that needs to change in the way that you implement it? Or I don't know whether I conveyed the message well, but I'd like to give an example. One of the things that I changed in my thesis supervision is that I started giving all of my feedback beforehand and only invited them for a follow-up meeting if they came up with concrete questions based on the feedback that I gave, so that at least then they could only that they had to read my feedback and had to sort of engage with the feedback that I had given. Because in the past, I also noticed, for example, that students didn't always took notes during feedback sessions, or whether this will now be a better way, I'm still sort of exploring. But I hope that sort of the gist is clear, that I think teaching efficiency does require you also to reflect critically on, is it really the method that is wrong, or how you implemented it that made it wrong, or all right. And sorry, my last slide. Sorry, I'm going a bit over time. Is what I think that we do need is to increase our knowledge. Teaching professionalization. So I started with this idea, this session also by saying, well, I think that we need to build sort of a community of practice, because I think how else will we know about all of the different means that we could perhaps become more efficient unless we exchange with each other. So I think we need to engage more in this sort of a community. I think also in teaching professionalization, I hope that basically this is what I hope to also instill on a generation of future teachers, is that they do reflect critically on the effectiveness and efficiency of their teaching. And I do think that we need to address some of these biases that I've started to notice in subtle research. So from showing something is effective, I think what is currently mostly the benchmark, to include or require perhaps a reflection on efficiency. And or when proposing new innovations, also that there needs to be some sort of benchmarking against what is the best alternative out there yet, so that we don't keep adding more stuff without sort of a critical reflection on what does it add in relation to existing ideas. And this is what I wanted to end up with my presentation, is basically that I wonder whether this could perhaps be something that we can actually explore in a future joint sessions event for ECPR, because we could also submit with a standing group for an event I think for next year perhaps. So exploring this question about efficiency in subtle research. And I'll stop here. This was